Bonjour à tous. Je pense qu'on va commencer tout de suite. Les absents ont toujours tort, hein. Ils rentreront par le haut de la salle. Donc, bienvenue pour cette première conférence plénière du Congrès de l'IDEA, où nous avons l'extrême honneur de recevoir Richard Lapchick, qui aurait dû être avec nous, mais vous savez que les conditions sanitaires font qu'il n'est pas toujours facile d'effectuer les voyages transatlantiques. Mais Richard a tenu à pouvoir faire cette conférence donc via Zoom. Donc nous le remercions. Nous remercions aussi l'ambassade des États-Unis qui avait tout organisé pour qu'il soit présent ici. Alors, vous connaissez probablement pas, en France, on connaît mal cette figure de Richard Lapchick, qui, aux États-Unis, est une figure très importante du monde du sport. C'est un militant des droits civiques, un militant pour l'égalité raciale dans le monde du sport, et plus généralement pour l'égalité raciale dans la société états-unienne par le biais du sport. Il a, après une vie de lutte, il a été nommé, on le surnomme la conscience raciale du sport, et il figure par exemple dans la liste des 100 personnes les plus importantes dans le monde du sport. Il enseigne également à l'Université de Floride dans un programme de management du sport. Et la conférence va s'organiser de la manière suivante. On va d'abord voir une petite vidéo qui a été réalisée par la chaîne ESPN, dont Richard est éditorialiste, qui vous fait une brève biographie. Ensuite, Richard nous parlera pendant une demi-heure sur le thème du sport dans un nouveau monde, un monde d'après le Covid et d'après la reconnaissance raciale. Et ensuite, nous lui poserons des questions dans la salle, mais aussi par Internet. Alors, ceux qui veulent poser des questions depuis Internet, n'hésitez pas à le faire par écrit dès le début de la conférence pour qu'on ait le temps de les centraliser et ensuite de choisir certaines pour les poser directement à Richard. Donc, encore une fois, merci Richard d'être là. Il est tôt chez toi. Et on va commencer tout de suite par cette vidéo d'ESPN qui retrace le parcours de Richard Lapchick.
Richard grew up in a family where there was a strong tradition of doing the right thing. His father was an iconic figure. He signed Sweetwater Clifton to the Knicks, breaking the color barrier.
His recollections alone of being around his father growing up would fill a dinner table conversation with great tales, meeting Jackie Robinson when he was a kid, seeing what his father went through for fielding the first black player in Knick history.
Joe was someone who, as a coach, never let race get in the way of doing the right thing. And there's no question that that had a huge impact on Richard himself.
When I was 14, I was at a basketball camp with 5 other white guys. One of the white guys was hurling the N-word at the black guy day in and day out till I challenged him, and this guy had knocked me out cold. Well, the black guy was Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, then Lou Alcindor, and a lifelong friendship grew out of that.
Everything Richard has fought for has not been popular at the time. And he has been this courageous light that has said, this needs to be said, this needs to be heard, and I'm going to say it.
There's a fine line sometimes between being courageous and putting your life on the line. With progress comes pain. And that was a price that he was willing to pay.
When I was the American leader of the sports boycott of South Africa, I was actually attacked in my office in a college library by 2 masked men and had the N-word carved in my stomach.
Richard had very bravely spoken out against apartheid. There were risks involved. There were just a lot of bigots who didn't like what he had to say.
He was attacked for standing up and wanting to right a wrong. And to be brutally attacked as he was, to have the N-word carved with scissors into his stomach, he had to have been frightened beyond words. And a lesser person would have said, okay, that's it, I'm done. Not Rich. they who did that, it's the wrong person.
I've been involved in civil rights for the last 28 years of my life, but I can never, ever, ever know what it's like to be black. That's an instantaneous, every minute sentence that society has given to black communities and Hispanic communities in this country, that discrimination can take place at any time.
My dad taught me that a leader is somebody who stands up for justice and doesn't block its path. I've spent most of my adult life trying to help young people who live in crises that have become more profound as the generations have gone on.
You know, he's really been in the forefront in the whole bridge between sports and using that to achieve equality, not only here in the United States, but around the world.
He's been involved in civil rights and race issues for his entire life.
I automatically smile when I think of Richard. Wow. I smile and also a tear comes to my eyes. Whew. He's a good man. I thank him. I'm appreciative of the work that he has done. Thank you. Thank you, Richard Lapchick. Thank you for being you, and thank you for wanting this world to be a better place, and because of you, it is.
Voilà, vous connaissez un peu mieux Richard Lapchick. Richard, good morning.
Morning.
It's early at your place, for us it's the beginning of the afternoon. The floor is yours. We are listening to you very carefully.
Thank you so much for the warm introduction, Fabien, and I appreciate everybody's in the audience. I had so wanted to be there with you in person in one of my favorite cities in the world, but my doctor, because I'm 76 and in that quote unquote vulnerable population, advised me not to fly at this particular time. So I missed the in-person contact, and I hope what I say will be helpful to everyone here. COVID has obviously changed the world, and sports world is part of that change. And I'm going to speak about that this morning, as well as about the effect of the racial reckoning on the world of sports, especially in the United States. I'm going to talk about the power of social sport to address various social justice issues. I'm going to talk about the disparity of opportunities for people of color and women in American sports, in our leagues and in our colleges in leadership positions. And finally, to talk upon what I think is one of the most important movements coming out in the United States and globally in the last couple of years, and that is athlete activism. We're all either from or involved one way or another, people in person there in Paris or people listening in the world of sport, and it's obviously a different world today than it was 18 months ago. I'm proud of the role that sport played in the period of COVID, because in the United States, we were totally ignoring the issue under the previous president. And then the NBA had a player test positively one afternoon in March, and Adam Silver, the commissioner, shut the league down within 2 hours. And within 2 days, the rest of sport had also shut down for the next 6 months, basically. It's estimated that if the United States had taken that type of actions in March, as opposed to later on, that 50,000 lives would have been saved. So sport did play that positive role. We saw the big-heartedness of sport. Immediately the day after the announcement of the shutdown, a 19-year-old rookie named Zion Williamson, who had never played a game in the NBA, announced he was donating $1 million to pay the salaries of the workers who would no longer be working at the arena he was supposed to be playing in New Orleans. Within the next month, players, coaches, teams, and leagues contributed more than $150 million as the economy was being crushed to fight against COVID, but also to support people who lost their jobs because of the various shutdowns. I felt the vacuum of sport. You know, there was no sport on television in the United States. We were watching international sport, and I will always remember ESPN covering Korean baseball and not thinking I would ever watch a Korean baseball game, but I ended up watching a few last year during that period of time just to fill the vacuum.
But then the murder of George Floyd changed everything, and several other murders that followed. The focus quickly shifted to police brutality in the United States, as well as various forms of systemic racism. So police brutality, because of it being captured on cell phone screens, left nothing to the imagination. The brutality of the murder of George Floyd was in our face in the United States probably every day for almost a year. And there were other murders at all. And I think we should emphasize that this was not something new. In 2019, the year before, there were only 27 days in the United States when a police officer did not shoot and kill a citizen of their community. Now, obviously, a lot of those were in the line of duty, but obviously also there were too many George Floyd type of incidents. 54% of the victims of those police shootings were people of color, in spite of being less than 40% of the population. But it also shifted our focus to not just police brutality, but to systemic racism and its effect on housing, healthcare, education, the banking system, and getting access to finances to have an opportunity to succeed in this country, as well as the criminal justice system. And I'll refer to all of that during the course of the talk, but what I want to focus on is facing this uncomfortable truth that America has been a very racist country that has discriminated against people of color since its founding. This was like the Me Too movement in the United States had us focus on several years ago, and still are, on sexism and misogyny. The Washington football team, some people in the audience may know, used to have a what I felt racial epithet attached as its nickname, as well as various symbols, and they changed that finally after so many years of protesting against it. And it made us also understand that literally the United States was founded on acts of genocide against our indigenous people. The Pulse nightclub shooting, so I live in Orlando, that's where the Pulse nightclub is. 49 people murdered deep into the night in one of the most homophobic incidents of my lifetime, made us focus on how far we have to go in fighting homophobia. We talk about sometimes after a weekend of brutal shootings in cities like Chicago. There were many reports last year where 12 children were killed over the weekend in Chicago. And of course, that's horrific, but it's a lot more horrific to understand that every single day in the United States, on average, 12 children under the age of 16 are killed by a handgun. So these are some of the things that I want to focus on this morning, but I also want to take a few minutes to elaborate on why this 76-year-old white guy is here talking to you, particularly about racism. You saw some of it in the video, but when I was 5 years old, I looked outside my bedroom window in Yonkers, New York, where I was being raised, which is this town right outside of New York City. And I saw my father's image swinging from a tree with people under the tree picketing. And for several years after that, I'd pick up the extension phone in our house, my dad not knowing I was listening, and it was racial epithet after racial epithet being hurled at him. I didn't even know what those racial epithets meant. All I could hear was the hatred in their voices. And I knew that there were a lot of people who hated this man who was my best friend. And I would find out later, as I grew older and could understand these things, that as the coach of the New York Knicks, as you saw in the video, he signed the first Black player in the history of the NBA. And there were a lot of people in this country who were not happy about that. So my dad is a Hall of Fame basketball player and coach. He was the first great big man in basketball. He played for a team called the original Celtics, which was the dominant team in the 1920s and 30s. He was, as I said, the first great big man. I was 6 feet tall in the 8th grade. I was one of the tallest players in New York City. And I was pretty heavily recruited by a number of high schools, including one called Power Memorial High School. I chose not to go there, but I became friends with the coach who opened the camp that you saw referred to in the video. And that's where I stood up against this player. There were 5 white players and a black player in addition to myself, all from his high school team. And I stood up to that player and took a punch in defending who turned out to be Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. A lifelong friendship has ensued since that time, nearly 60 years ago now. But the importance of being friends and getting to know Kareem Abdul-Jabbar as a 15-year-old white kid from an almost all white neighborhood was I suddenly had a young urban African-American lens to see what was happening to his community and other communities of color. And I promised myself as a 15-year-old that I was going to spend the rest of my life working in the area of civil rights. I had no idea what that meant as a 15-year-old, what it would look like, but I decided that that was what I was going to do. I pursued a PhD in international race relations. It was actually the first degree in international race relations in the United States. And I did my doctoral dissertation on how South Africa used sport as part of its foreign policy and the international response to it, and compared it to how the Nazis had done that in the 30s. I started teaching at a college in Virginia in 1970, and in 1973, that dissertation was published as a book. I started speaking about apartheid and ultimately founded the sports boycott of South Africa in the United States. It was obviously a vibrant movement in other countries, including France. I spent many days over the years in France in anti-apartheid demonstrations with the French anti-apartheid movement. But the first South African team was coming to the United States in 1978, and my job was to try and get those matches canceled as the head of the coalition that had been formed. So I went down to where the matches were scheduled to be held in Nashville, Tennessee, and we built up a significant momentum to try to get those matches canceled. The African governments with whom I was working closely asked me to announce that they would boycott the Los Angeles Olympic Games in 1984 if this team was allowed to come to the United States. So I announced that at a press conference before I gave my last speech of that weekend to the student body at Vanderbilt University. And a correspondent came up to me after the press conference and said that the Davis Cup sponsor had pulled out. It looked like the matches themselves might get canceled. I announced that to the crowd. They went crazy. They were an anti-apartheid crowd. And when I flew home to Virginia that night, I felt maybe for the first time in my life, I did something worthwhile. The next night was depicted pretty graphically in the video you just saw. I was working late in my college office. After the building closed, when I heard a knock on the door, I assumed it was campus security, so I didn't hesitate to open it, but instead it was two men wearing stocking masks, where, as you heard, they caused liver damage, kidney damage, a hernia, concussion, and carved the N-word, a misspelled N-word, by the way, in my stomach with a pair of my office scissors. Fabien, lying in the hospital bed that night, I decided that if people had gone to the length they did to try to stop my father 28 years before, and the length they did to try to stop me that evening, that I was going to spend the rest of my life using the sports platform in particular to address various social justice issues, but especially racism. I moved to New York City after the attack. The United Nations offered me a job there, and I worked there for the next 6 years. And in 1981, the next South African team was coming. It was a rugby team on its way to play in New Zealand, where rugby is much more popular than it is in the United States, but they had 3 test matches scheduled for the States. We reformed the coalition and decided that we were going to get those matches canceled. Anybody who was tracking my movements would have known that every Thursday night I was at what was called the Church Center for the United Nations, organizing a coalition of 100 different organizations that were coming together to try to get those matches canceled. I had purchased a car from a colleague at the United Nations that night, and after the meeting was over, I was going to drive to our apartment on the Upper West Side of New York City, and then head up to Woodstock, New York the next day, which is where we had a country home and my family was spending the summer. But when I got back to the apartment, they had come back here to surprise me, and it was them that was surprised. Our apartment had been ransacked. The only thing that they didn't touch anything of my wife at the time and our children. They went through all of my stuff, and the only thing they took was a manuscript of a book I was writing about this particular period of time. The New York City police told my family to go back up to Woodstock, which they did the next day in that car that I mentioned that I had purchased the night before from a colleague at the United Nations. I went back to the UN, this time under heavily armed guard. And at 11 o'clock that morning, my then wife called me up and said, I'm okay. And I didn't know there was a chance that she wouldn't be okay, but going 65 miles an hour on the New York State Thruway, thank God in the middle of the morning when there was not much traffic, the car's engine seized up and she was able to wrestle it to the side of the road, bringing herself and our children to safety. Someone had tampered with the engine in the streets of New York City the night before. Several days later, the New York City police found somebody under the hood of the car we were replacing and chased them into Central Park. We got all of the matches canceled, but the South Africans didn't want to try to save face. So they scheduled a match in Albany, New York, which is in a remote part of New York State, thinking that protesters wouldn't go there. But of course, we organized busloads of people to go to Albany. I had made a hotel reservation in Albany, but I decided that instead I was going to stay at that house in Woodstock that I mentioned earlier, which was not far from Albany. And I was there with 2 bodyguards, and we woke up the next morning to the news that a bomb had gone off outside the hotel I was supposed to be staying in, showing the depth of what people were willing to do to try and stop us. So my journey on the issue of race in sport has been personal and very profound. I've had other people have tremendous impact on me. My sister, who's now 87, I'm at 76, was a civil rights activist in the 1950s before it was even called the civil rights movement. She moved to Africa in 1961, and that's when I started reading about Africa and falling in love with the continent. Things are better for women, but they're obviously still not right. In the last presidential campaign, and as well as in the previous one, there was a lot of discussion about women earning 78 cents on the dollar as white men in the same job. What usually was left out of the discussion was that if you were an African-American woman, you were earning 64 cents on the dollar. If you were a Latina, you were earning 53 cents on the dollar. Women make up nearly 51% of the population in the United States, but they only hold 20% of the seats in the House of Representatives and the Senate. We rank globally, by we, I mean the United States globally, we rank 100th in terms of the percentage of women holding national office. We rank behind Afghanistan, Iraq, and Pakistan. Maybe that's why we're one of 4 countries, including Swaziland, Lesotho, and Papua New Guinea, that do not have paid maternity leave. We rank 46th in the world in maternal mortality rates, behind Saudi Arabia, Libya, Kuwait, and Kazakhstan. Only 4% of Fortune 500 companies today, as we meet here in 2021, are led by women. But there's so many other social justice issues that I believe the power of sport can deal with. Our country, as I said, our children are learning how to hate as they grow up. When Barack Obama became president, there were 925 hate groups. When Donald Trump left the presidency, there were 1,100 hate groups. There was an average of about 50 hate crimes a day. During the Obama administration, that skyrocketed to over 500 hate incidents a day during the Trump administration. Our children are also waging war on one another. I mentioned near the beginning that on average in the United States, 12 children under the age of 16 die of a handgun wound every day. 400,000 high school students in the United States were brought to emergency rooms in the 2020 as a result of a violent incident that took place during high school hours on high school property. 400,000 emergency room cases. High school dropout rate in urban America is 40%, meaning 40% of mostly people of color aren't going to get even a high school degree at that point. Men's violence against women, 4.5 million American women are battered every year, 900,000 are raped every year. It's a plague on our society. Teenage pregnancy, the rate is 34% of all girls in the United States will have a child before they reach the age of 20. And when researchers ask them, why did you risk possibly finishing your education and getting the career you might have had aspired to, the almost universal response those girls gave was, I wanted somebody to love me. They didn't feel loved at that point in their lives. We're the biggest consumers of drugs in the United States, and the biggest consumers of drugs in the United States are people under the age of 25. Why do you take a drug? Presumably you think you feel better with it than without it. Performance enhancing drugs are not mostly consumed by National Football League players, Major League Baseball players, track and field athletes. They're consumed by teenage boys under the age of 16 who aren't athletes at all, who are very unhappy with the whatever they felt God gave them, and try to become stronger, faster, whatever it is they try to do by taking this performance enhancing drug. There's a report of child abuse in the United States made every 10 seconds, every 10 seconds. And it's estimated that 1 in 10 cases of child abuse are actually reported. You can do the math. So part of my education in getting the degree in international race relations was studying the Atlantic slave trade. So I knew that during the 240-year period that the slave trade was operated between Africa and the United States and the Americas, that 10 million Africans were enslaved in the Americas, that 8 million were enslaved on the continent of Africa, and another 8 million were enslaved 6 million rather, were enslaved in Asia. So over a 240-year period, 24 million Africans were enslaved. Today, as we meet here in various places, me in Orlando, you in Paris, it's estimated that between 28 and 32 million people globally are victims of human trafficking, are enslaved in whatever they have been drug into by the traffickers. But what I really want to focus on today is the wealth gap, because the wealth gap is what causes all the other things that we've been talking about this morning. According to the Forbes list of the 400 wealthiest Americans, 400 people have a greater aggregate wealth than all 42 million African Americans combined. I'm going to repeat that because it sounds so incredible. The 400 wealthiest Americans have an aggregate wealth greater than all 42 million African Americans combined. The result is and impacts everything that we talked about earlier in terms of the racial reckoning, healthcare, education, the criminal justice system, obviously the banking system, housing, public housing in the United States is affected. And the rich are simply getting richer. The number of people who have become billionaires during this period of COVID has tripled over previous years. If you are a Black infant, you're going to die at twice the rate of white babies. If you're a victim of COVID and a person of color, you're going to contract the disease 3 times as much as white people and die 4 times as much as white people have from COVID. We make up 5% of the world's population in the United States, but we make up 25% of the world's prison population in the United States. They're mostly brown or Black. They mostly have committed crimes that won't even be on the books in several years, as so many states in the United States have removed drug laws. These are no longer criminal offenses that most of them are in there for. People will tell me, well, but when they get out, they'll have a fair chance at life if they were in for 2 or 3 years or whatever the sentence was. And my response to them is they can't get public housing, they can't get public assistance, they can't vote. And if they go for a job and the employer asks, as they usually do, whether it's on paper or in person, have you ever committed a felony? If the answer is yes, that's usually going to be the end of the interview. If we were here, the 30 minutes that I'm going to be with you this morning, this is what typically would happen in my country, in the United States, during this 30-minute period, not over a week or a month or a year. 70 children dropped out of school. 23 high school students were victimized by violence. A child under the age of 16 was killed by a handgun. 42 children were reported missing. 23 babies were born to a teenage mother. 258 women or girls were battered. 52 were raped. 57 were enslaved during the 30 minutes that I'm going to be sharing with you here right now. I don't have any doubt that if more women and people of color were in charge of the government, of corporate America, institutions of higher education, every aspect of America, that we'd be addressing the social justice issues that I just mentioned. But instead, you understand what we focus on in Washington is hardly those things. I'm going to talk for a minute about the power of sport. It was addressed somewhat in the video that you saw. It's now a couple of days after the 20th anniversary of 9/11 in the United States, and a lot of attention was paid to the 20th anniversary, both on television and all forms of the media. And none of them failed to acknowledge the fact that when the New York Mets played the first baseball game after 9/11 and won with what they called an heroic home run at the end of the game by a Mets player, that it started to bring people back together. But it was when the New York Yankees, who a lot of people around the country hate if you're not a Yankee fan, they don't just dislike them. America became Yankee fans because they were competing in the World Series in this time, and it give the New York City people hope that life could resume. Colin Kaepernick took a knee now 5 years ago. It's hard to believe that has been 5 years, but a lot have been athlete activism followed, particularly in the last 2 years. I believe that it was the death of Muhammad Ali that shook athletes into understanding that they can become activists and survive in the sport of their choice. Up to that period of the last few years, if you were an athlete and stood up for something, your career pretty much ended. But people, when Ali died, they saw tons of media coverage of 120,000 people in Louisville, Kentucky, where he was from, in the funeral entourage, another 17,000 listening to the service. My wife and family and I were blessed to be close friends with Muhammad and Lonnie Ali since the mid-1970s. And we went to the funeral itself and left with a tremendous hope that his spirit would imbue the future of athlete activism. And I think those athletes who maybe knew something about Ali, maybe knew he was a great athlete and had done some political things, saw so many stories about him doing them throughout his lifetime. And I think that inspired athletes to get actively involved. And I think this year, for those of you who read about it, or perhaps watched it, when the Milwaukee Bucks, an NBA team, refused to come out during the NBA playoffs, an unheard of gesture, because of the shooting of a Black person in Kenosha, Wisconsin, not far from where the Bucks play, and the league shut down an hour later. Every sport shut down the next day because this issue of police brutality kept going on. I think what the Bucks did that day was the most important act of athlete activism since John Carlos and Tommy Smith in Mexico City took that Olympic podium stand, and Ali refused to fight in Vietnam. What we have now in the United States is massive numbers of athletes standing up for social justice and everybody taking note. But if the power of sport, this power can be diminished if sport itself isn't living up to those ideals. So we published something called the Racial and Gender Report Card. In our organization, it analyzes the hiring practices by race and gender of all the major sports in the United States, and as well as college sports in the United States. And we're literally releasing today a report on the sports media, who represents us in the sports media. The sports media are going to get today an F for gender, the only F we give out overall for either race or gender. But in this pro sports and in college sport, only the WNBA and NBA get A's for racial hiring practices. The rest get between B minuses, D pluses, C pluses, and B's. For gender hiring practices, it's even worse. Again, only the WNBA gets an A for gender hiring practices, including and the NBA gets a B. That's by far the highest grade among the men's sports. The others, NFL got a C, the college sport got an F, Major League Baseball got a C, Major League Soccer got a C minus. I teach in a graduate program in the United States, and if you get anything below a B, it's considered a failure. So if somebody gets a C, to me, that's the same as failing. So we are not hiring the way we talk about. And I think as a result of the racial reckoning, that I'm hopeful that that's going to change. I'm hopeful that because of the racial reckoning, things are going to change in general. I remember in 1977, I was in Lusaka in Zambia at an anti-apartheid conference, and I was speaking to a man who had been my mentor. His name was George Hauser. He was the leader of the anti-apartheid movements and the anti-colonial efforts in the United States from the 1950s on. He was on the first Freedom Ride in 1944, spent 2 years in prison as a conscientious objector, founded the Congress of Racial Equality, and he was a white guy. And when I read about George Hauser, it gave me hope that as a white person, that belief that I wanted to fulfill as a 15-year-old to spend the rest of my life working in the area of civil rights was a possibility. We later became close friends, but in 1977, we were together in Lusaka, and I said, George, do you think we'll ever see South Africa and Namibia, and it was called at the time Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, free? Historically, there was no reason for optimism. It was 12 years before Mandela was going to be released. In fact, the rumors were that he was going to die in prison of tuberculosis. Apartheid was at its height in South Africa, as well as was the rule of government in Namibia and operative in then Rhodesia. And George surprisingly said, Rich, I think we will live to see that day. No historical proof of that. It's in my gut. I have a gut feeling. And on May 10th of 1994, George Hauser and I stood on the steps of the Union buildings in Pretoria as Nelson Mandela's guest. when he was inaugurated as president of what had been the most racist system of government on the face of the earth in the second half of the 20th century. And if that man could have become president that day of this type of country, and historically himself a political prisoner for 27 years, then George Hauser and I knew that day that anything and everything is possible. I feel in my gut today that there has been a significant change in the United States that can be sustained. And I think a lot of that has to do with having a large number of athletes, particularly Black athletes, standing up for justice and not blocking its path. These are people who are also wealthy and can contribute resources to their social justice causes, and they're doing that in large numbers. I've stayed in the world of sport for all these years because of one thing that is a symbol of what I hope is eventually going to happen. When you step into the huddle, which is what I call the miracle of sport, I can't think of any other place in the United States where it doesn't matter if you're African American or white or Latino or Asian American or Native American or Arab American. It doesn't matter if you're Protestant, Catholic, Buddhist, Sikh, Jew, Hindu, Muslim, young or old, gay or straight, come from a rich family or a poor family. It does not matter. Your team will not win if you don't pull together as a team once you break that huddle. Imagine if that was operative in institutions of higher education, corporate America, faith-based America, and globally. What a different world it would be. I'm going to conclude with sharing with you when I was starting out in this in the late 1960s, early 1970, I went through a training on issues of racism, and the facilitator did an icebreaker where she asked everybody to write down on a piece of paper what they would like to see on their memorial when they died and were buried. And I wrote this, and it was close to including all these. There have been several that have been added since then, but what I wrote at that session was, you didn't have to be Jewish to want to fight against anti-Semitism. You didn't have to be a person of color to want to fight against racism. You didn't have to be a woman to want to fight against sexism. You didn't have to be from the LGBTQ community to want to fight against homophobia. You didn't have to be Muslim to want to fight against Islamophobia. You didn't have to have a physical or mental disability to want to fight for people who do. You didn't have to be an immigrant or a refugee to fight against xenophobia. He understood that we are all cut from the same human fabric. My friends here in the audience and those watching, if we have taught our children how to hate, we can teach them how to love again. And if they're waging war on one another, we have the opportunity and the possibility of giving them the tools of peace to change that future. Thank you so much for listening this afternoon.
Thank you very much, Richard, for your speaking. It's time to let the people speak. If someone wants to ask a question, we have a micro.
If it's asked in French, I would appreciate it if you translate it, please.
Yes, I think they will ask in English. They understood you perfectly. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Richard, for this fantastic overview, and I'm a big fan of your work. Question I had was, you mentioned that you view the Wildcat strike, as they call it, by the Bucks, which escalated into other teams and other leagues, as a major turning point. Why do you view that particular act versus kind of the different building of different types of athlete activism over the past several years? Why was that so different? If you could just unpack that a little bit more, please.
Sure, I'd be happy to. And thank you for the nice things you said about me. First of all, it was an entire team. It wasn't an individual. An entire organization followed immediately. Not an hour went by before the NBA and the Players Association decided to shut down, so the entire NBA was behind it. Then in the next couple of days, by the end of the next couple of days, all the other sports had shut down. Nobody had ever responded to athletes the way the sports leagues themselves did, because of the Bucks action, but also because of the period we were in during this racial reckoning. You know, we had the discussions on the racial aspect of what was going on in America had been slightly muted in the previous month, But then that shooting in Kenosha, Wisconsin, where police shot an unarmed man 6 times and didn't kill him, but made him so that I believe he still can't walk. In the view of his children who were sitting in the car, it was another horrific moment caught on video. And I think the athletes themselves, not just on the Bucks, but they got so much support because they said, we just can't play a game in the midst of all this. We need to take a stand. And the next 2 days discussion, you might remember, was all about, should we resume play and use that resumption of play to create social justice messaging on a consistent basis, or should we just end the season? There were some people who wanted to end the season, but the decision overwhelmingly was to resume play, and the leagues all told them that they would get a full shot at whatever display about social justice issues that they wanted to make before the game, during the game. Every NBA court had Black Lives Matter painted on it. That was happening in NFL stadiums when the NFL resumed. They were playing the Black National Anthem before the national anthem in the NFL, something I never thought I would possibly see. So I think it was that moment, and it was a particular moment in time because of when it took place, I think, that made it different and make athletes now, want to stand up. The NBA created the Kareem Abdul-Jabbar Social Justice Champion Award just recently and gave it to a player named Carmelo Anthony, who's been a star player, but who's also been a leader of the fight against various forms of social justice, injustice, rather.
Yes, it was a question from Lindsay Krasnov, another American. There is a question online from Joseph Baudreau. I read it. Is there a journalist that you admire most in covering political activism in sports in the US? Do you think there is a shift in sports journalism in this regard compared to decades past?
Okay, so I think I mentioned earlier that we are literally releasing the sports media racial and gender report card this afternoon. The journalist I probably admire most, her name is Jamel Hill. She became the first African-American columnist here in Orlando a long time ago. She actually taught in our program briefly, but she was the first person that I knew that called on air Donald Trump a white supremacist in the beginning of that shift of politics in the United States. And of course, a lot of people, including myself, have called him white supremacist, as well as many of his followers since that particular period of time. So I was grateful to her. She lost her job as a result of it. She's flourishing now during the period of the racial reckoning, but it took a lot of courage for her to do that. We've seen an increase in this new racial and gender report card in the number of people of color hired as columnists, reporters, sports editors, deputy sports editors, and web specialists. It's still not where we hope it will be. They received a B+ for racial hiring practices, but they continue to receive an F in every single category, one of those categories for gender hiring practices. So and there was a slight improvement in all those categories, but it's still an F. So we have a long, long way to go in terms of getting what I believe should be fair representation of women and people of color in the sports media, as well as the media in general.
Another question from the audience, please.
Yes, thank you, Richard, for this wonderful conference. I just wanted to ask you if you thought that sport could have and preserve this power for social transformation if it didn't go itself through this very transformation. And I'm asking that question in the light of the current situation where basically the economy, the orientation on business, the emphasis on business, profit, the capitalistic frenzy may tend to a little bit downplay the humanistic values of sport. And also as a corollary remark, when you were saying at the end of your conference that it didn't matter who you were in terms of race, gender, sexuality, what actually mattered was your involvement in the team for the team to win. What happens when the team loses? Because in the European context, very recently, some games were lost, and the actual result, especially in the social media, was that some players, some sportsmen were actually being attacked, and race and nationality did matter at that moment.
First of all, I'm painfully aware of the extent of racist outbursts in a lot of the football matches in Europe. I've come there for the various soccer federations to try to provide insights into what to do. We're talking to the ECA about a racial and gender report card for the ECA, but we're also doing diversity and inclusion training for the ECA. But in the United States, what I could tell you, the best news was that Milwaukee, which didn't win when they stepped away from the game, when it resumed, but this year they won the NBA championship. And there were so many fans who were rooting for the Bucks because of what they did for social justice, who would never have rooted for a team from a relatively small city like Milwaukee. And I think one of the big changes this year has also been when Colin Kaepernick took a knee. I think most of the American people were opposed to it, led by Donald Trump. When the racial reckoning has been taking place, when the Bucks walked off the court, all the surveys of sports fans said that the sports fans overwhelmingly supported athlete activism and wanted the teams to support athlete activism and wanted their brands to support athlete activism. We're talking about in the area of 70 to 80% in all those categories. And that is, for me, represents a very big shift. To have the public opinion following and favoring the athletes is going to mean it's more likely that the leagues will continue to, as well as the brands. If you watch American television during sports events recently, including during the Olympic Games, just this past few weeks, the social justice content of the commercials, virtually, I would guess, I haven't systematically studied this, but just observing 25 to 30% are more about social justice messaging, and that whoever, Unilever, I'm making that up, supports these social justice efforts. So I think the climate is more, there's more opportunity to sustain these changes today than there ever has before. Of course, we could lose that momentum, and we have to be vigilant about it. I mean, people worried, we had the vote for first the presidency and then 2 critical Senate seats in the state of Georgia. So the Democrats got control of the Senate by winning those 2 seats in a re-election. That was an easy focus for players and everybody else to focus on what you're going to do. But I think that the next question is, what can we focus on now that's going to bring people together and rally around? And in this country, I think the issue of voter suppression is probably that issue. But I think the importance of focusing all that energy is critically important.
I would have a little question about what you're actually wearing. Isn't it a sports jersey? Is it a US jersey, or it could be
It is
French,
actually the French national team's jersey. And I'm going to step away and hopefully you can see what's on the back. Tell me if you can. Can you see it?
Yes, we saw it, yes. It reminds us good memories.
So when I came to Europe to work with the various soccer federations, that's when we met. And we spent 4 or 5 days together. I really appreciated who he was and what he stood for. And then he came to the United States to visit us for 5 days. And that's when he gave me this jersey. And I wear it proudly in your presence and in the presence of other audiences as well.
Okay. Is there another question? Maybe you talk to us about your activism against apartheid in the United States. You led this struggle in the 70s when this struggle was not yet well known in Western societies. Could you tell us a little bit more about your experience as an anti-apartheid activist?
It was, and obviously the attack had a lot to do with my experience. But even without that, when we had our first demonstration in the United States, which was at the US Open Tennis Championships in 1977, we had 75 protesters turn out, and we thought that was a raving success because the anti-apartheid movement was so small. By the time that the next year rolled around, we were having 4,000 or 5,000 people protest the Davis Cup matches, which did eventually get held. We haven't had no sports contacts with South Africa between that rugby team that I mentioned and the end of apartheid. I'm happy to tell you that I went to the NBA and the NBA Players Association because Nelson Mandela had asked us to bring a program that we started called Project Teamwork, which taught conflict resolution skills through the use of sports. And it was named America's most successful violence prevention program by the Clinton administration. And Mandela, not yet President Mandela, but who would become President Mandela, asked us to bring it there. And I asked the NBA and the Players Association to come with us to make more attention being brought to what we were trying to do. So we went, and on the trip where some of you may know if you follow basketball, Dikembe Mutombo, Alonzo Mourning, and Patrick Ewing were the players. And, they made a tremendous impact in South Africa. Not only do they have an incredible physical presence, but they're powerful people and powerful voices as well. And basketball, our design was it would become the first integrated sport in South Africa. Soccer or football was played mostly by black people in South Africa. Rugby and cricket was almost exclusively white. So basketball became one of the first areas that had an integrated sport. I'm delighted to tell you that the NBA has gone back to South Africa literally every year with a program called Basketball Without Borders. They opened an office in Johannesburg. The NBA now is an African league. It's the only league that the NBA has started outside of the United States. The attention on Africa certainly isn't sufficient. We're seeing it right now as in the United States. As a 76-year-old, I'm looking forward to having a third COVID shot, booster shot, and it's going to be very easy for me to get that. Yet I understand that on the continent of Africa, as this is freely being distributed in the United States, that 2% of the population of the continent of Africa has had the possibility of getting that COVID vaccine. So this disparity in resources and the distribution and sharing of resources is still a major issue for everybody in the world.
Thank you. Is there a last question?
Good morning, and thank you for your wonderful presentation. There will be, the next Olympic Games in winter will take place in China, and there have been calls in different parts of the world for boycotting these Olympic Games on the grounds of the situation in Xinjiang with the Uyghur minority. What do you think about this kind of measure proposed in occasion of Olympic Games? I remember the boycott in the occasion of the Olympic Games in Moscow many years ago. But what do you think about the boycott at this level, at the level of the Olympic Games? Thank you.
It's a really important question. I think the IOC, as it's currently composed, the nations that are represented there, which of course are disproportionately in favor of European and American vote and US votes. But nonetheless, so I don't expect that the boycott would actually result in the games being called, but I think it's going to present a lot more information about the issue that you just talked about, which is one of the worst in the world as far as I'm concerned. And I think the more attention we pay to it, that's why, we used the sports boycott of South Africa to educate Americans, because we knew that the media wasn't covering what apartheid was all about in the news pages, but they were covering it in the sports pages because we were protesting. So I encourage people to be actively protesting against that. We have a World Cup taking place soon. That's going to be, all the facilities were built on what a lot of people believe was to be slave labor. being brought in from outside the country in intolerable conditions. More than 1,000 people died in the construction process. And I think we have to use that as a method of also publicizing what human trafficking is all about, as well as the effects of human trafficking.
Okay, thank you, Richard. Time is passing by, unfortunately. In my name, in the name of the organizers, of the audience, thank you very much again for your speaking and for the debate. You will be always welcome in Paris, so we hope that we could meet each other very soon and have a good morning, have a good day in the United States. Again, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me and accepting the fact that I had to do this virtually. It was a pleasure to deal with the organizers of the conference and to meet you, Fabien, and to hear the questions from the audience there. And I wish everybody a great remainder of the conference. Thank you very much.